Hello and welcome. On Trailblazers today, we have John Gross, better known by those who know him best as Jack. Jack is a real estate broker, investor, entrepreneur, and owner of the real estate franchised firm Better Homes and Gardens Real Estate Cassadon Realty in Bethlehem. He also has a property management company, Cassadon Property Management, and a development company, Petra Holdings. He's actively involved and has served in key leadership roles through the governing real estate trade organization, the Greater Lehigh Valley Realtors. He works as an advocate for home ownership and in the best interest of homeowners through various initiatives. He's an avid baseball enthusiast, a diehard Boston Red Sox fan. He's a philanthropist, and he's a mentor. Thanks for joining us, John.
Absolutely. Glad to be here.
John, how many years have you been a broker for?
A broker? I've been a broker since 2005. I've been a realtor since 1987. So I will be entering 40. I'm 2 years away from 40 years in the industry. I started when I was 18 years old.
Wow. Oh, my gosh. Okay, so I know this story, but please share it for our listeners. How did you get your start? It is a pretty interesting story. Walk us through that.
Let's see. I've been on my own since I was 14 years old. Mom split. Dad was very, very ill. Died when I was young. Was always, if I wanted to eat, I had to work. So, I got through high school by the skin of my teeth.
Did you graduate?
I did.
Wow.
I did graduate. That's an interesting story, but that's another day. But I always worked. I was always an entrepreneur. I cut grass. I shoveled snow. I sold baseball cards. You name it. If it was entrepreneurial in some way, I did it. And went to go work through high school. I did work for a company called Rickle Home Center, which back then was the Home Depot of the day.
Okay.
And I worked there through high school full time. I always knew I wasn't going to college, so I just figured I would work. They really loved me at Rickles. I was, the youngest section manager in the chain. I was, I was doing all the right things and working very hard for them.
Right.
Until things just didn't go right, and I saw how the structure after high school, I was working there full time, and I saw the structure of how the management was, and I knew it probably wasn't going to work out for me. Ironically enough, at my dad's funeral, my first broker, who was a very good friend of his, approached me and said, "Hey, John, if you ever think about getting into the real estate business, give me a call." And within a couple of months, basically, Rickles pissed me off. So within a couple of months, I came home one day. I called Bob and I said, "Is that job offer still good?" I didn't understand it. I didn't know what that meant, what being in real estate meant at the time. But he said, "Absolutely," and that's where I got started. I started going to school.
But tell me how. So you sat down. He kind of showed you a little bit about the ropes, but what did you do?
Well, at 18 years old, 19 years old, not many people are going to entrust for 90% of the people in this country is their largest asset.
Right.
Not many people are going to entrust a 19-year-old kid, to handle their transaction, whether they're buying or selling. So, I did struggle for a couple of years. Most of my buyers were first-time home buyers. My clients were first-time home buyers who were still older than me.
And how did you acquire them?
I did home buyer seminars.
Okay.
I did. There used to be a thing called newspapers that people used to read, and I put a classified ad in the newspapers and offering free home buyer seminars.
Yeah.
And even though when they would walk in, they would see how young I was, I had this great deep voice, and I had a lot of knowledge because I ate, slept, and drank real estate. Within 5 minutes, it really didn't. I won them over. It didn't seem that my age wasn't a factor anymore. They could tell that I knew what I was talking about. And then that went on for a couple of years. I struggled. I did. No bones about it. But, it was grind. And that grind was very, very important. And I learned so much, from that. And then about in my early 20s, I sold a house to a friend of mine. It was a foreclosure, and it was interesting because the process was different. And on the listing side, on the listing agent side, I was on the buyer side, but I could see how different the process was, and it kind of interested me. And then a few months after that, I sold another one to another friend of mine, and there was a different listing broker, and there was a different process. Mm-hmm. And I just started doing some research, and we used to have these things back in the day called MLS books, and they would be 2 inches thick.
Yes.
You know?
Which is now today the MLS listing service,
Correct.
which you can search homes on.
Correct.
Right. But it used to be books.
Used to be books.
There must have been tons.
Yeah, there was tons of them, and you would get them every other week. You get a new one every other week. But I did some research on bank properties and how banks sold properties when they did foreclosures or sheriff sales. And it really, really intrigued me. So I learned as much as I could, and then I thought, well, I got to start cold calling banks. And I have to start, I think I'm ready. I'm going to start bringing.
Now, had you had any cold calling experience before?
I had a ton of cold. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
There was a phone book originally.
Yeah,
right?
well, I'll tell you. Yeah,
story.
when I first, yes, we don't train today like I was trained back then. I walked into my first broker's office and I said, "How do I get leads?" And he looked at me and he said, "Leads? You want leads?" And I said, "Yeah, leads. How do I get leads?" And he picked up a phone book, which was about 3 inches thick, and he threw it at me, and he said, "There's all the leads you need right there. Start calling." And I said, "Well, what do I say?" And he said, "You'll figure it out." And that was my entry into cold calling and things like that. But I knocked on doors. Back in the day, we did all those things. We knocked on doors. And it was a struggle at first. Nobody likes doing that. After a while, you get thick skin, and what really helped me was one time I was blessed by the fact that I went to a class down in Philadelphia, and I sat next to who I found out later was the #1 agent for Century 21 in Pennsylvania.
Oh, wow.
And he told me a story. Him and I were having lunch, and I said, "So how do you do it? How do you get to be #1?" And he said, because all I do is knock on doors. And I said, "Well, what do you say?" And he goes, "Well, I pick a neighborhood and I go and I knock on a door and say, I'm so-and-so and I'm, specializing in this location. I'm just wondering if you know of anybody that's interested in thinking about buying or selling a home." And I said, "That's it?" And he goes, "Basically, that's it." And he said, "You'd be amazed how much people will help you if you ask, And I said, "Well, when do you stop?" And he looked at me like I had two heads. And he goes, "What do you mean?" I said, "When do you stop?" And he says, "You mean in a day?" I said, "Yeah, how many do you do?" He goes, I stop when I get one. And that struck me as it wasn't his thought to check a box and say, "Okay, I knocked on 100 doors today." It was his thought to get one, So that kind of changed my perspective on soliciting or knocking on doors and cold calling and things like that. But
You cold called the banks.
Yes, I cold called the bank. I started cold calling banks, and I was still, early 20s, 21, 22 years old at this time.
Completely green. Yeah.
Well, yeah, I was green, but I knew what to say. I knew how to say it. I knew how to talk. And again, it was awesome because I had this. Here was the other wonderful thing about working with banks and their foreclosures for me. We did everything over the phone. We did everything by fax. So when I started getting my first listings, all right, they never met me. So again, I have this great deep voice and I was very knowledgeable, but they never saw how young I was, right? And it didn't hit me till years later. I had been cold calling all this time Fannie Mae, Federal National Mortgage, because if you got the Fannie Mae account, that just steamrolled everything for you,
right?
And I had been cold calling them for a year and a half. And one day I walked into the office and the secretary handed me a message, and it was the lady at Fannie Mae that I had been cold calling. And I knew this was awesome. So I ran to the phone and called her. And she said that she wasn't happy with the broker she was working with in Lehigh County, and she had a problem property, and he wasn't responding or doing anything about it. And she said, if I fix the problem and sell the property for her. She would give me Lehigh County, all their assets in Lehigh County to work on.
And what year was that?
Oh my gosh, that had to be, I would say, early 90s, 92-ish.
Oh my gosh.
92, yes, around there.
And so that laid the foundation.
That laid the foundation. Next thing you know, I handled 8 counties for Fannie Mae within a couple of months, and then I got the HUD contract. And once you had those contracts, all the banks want to deal with you.
What did that grit and grind? I mean, what did that teach you? I mean, that must have been exhilarating.
Oh, it was. It was definitely. I knew the potential of that. When that message came in, I knew the potential of what that could be. And it turned out to be so, and I just built on it. And then, Fannie Mae, they would use me. I was kind of like a wonder boy for them for many years. And they would actually have agents from across the country call me, and I would train agents across the country for them, sometimes fly out and meet with them for a day or whatever, just because I developed this system of handling foreclosure and REO properties for banks and government, and it was a very good system. And not all agents that were working for them understood what they were doing, you know what I mean? And it just changed things. But then it was funny because there was a time when I was asked to come down, and even back then in the mid-90s, I was a very techie guy. And I loved the internet. I was probably the first agent on the East Coast to actually have his own website.
Oh, wow.
And I was definitely the first agent that required other agents to download documents because we had these addendums that had to be attached to offers and things like that. So Fannie Mae asked me to come down and do a demonstration in front of about 500 agents from across the country on digital cameras because I was the first agent to use a digital camera, all right? And, oh, my God, I was nervous as heck. I was so nervous. Well, anyways, I'm walking through the hotel, and understand, I hadn't met anybody I've been working for them for years, but I hadn't met anybody yet, for a couple of years. And I walked up, and the lady turned around and she goes, are you Jack? And I said, yeah. She goes, oh my gosh, I had no idea you were this young. I said, well, that was part of the plan, But
that's incredible. So what did that, grit and that grind, experience, doing all of that and kind of laying the framework for really what's grown into your life, right? What has that taught you? I mean,
listen, you're going to have good days and bad days. There were days of that I would look in the mirror and say, what the freak am I doing this for? And then there were other days where I would look in the mirror and I would say, I don't want to do anything else ever again. Mm-hmm. But the main thing that changed me for the first couple of years, I didn't jump into cold calling or doing any of that stuff immediately. It was a process, right? It was a process of fear against necessity. So, and there was a day, I remember this day, I was, 19, 20 years old, and I remember I looked in the mirror and I was just so disgusted because it had been so many rejections and I was just so frustrated. And I looked myself in the mirror and I said, you have to stop pretending. You have to stop fooling around now. You have to take this seriously. You can't just do 2 or 3.
And how old were you at that time?
I think 20.
Okay.
You gotta be a man. See, it's time to man up, time to do what you got to do, or do what my other people said and go beg for my old job back. And I was never going to do that. Mm-hmm. So I had to man up. Man up, take rejection, move forward.
And so, real estate is a business of ebbs and flows, sometimes feast or famine, depending on, how much you're willing to work. Really. So if you were 20, then I imagine you were probably approaching your first marriage, maybe even some kids, right? You have 2
Well,
kids.
I wanted all those things.
Right. And so
I
you
wanted
need to
all
lay
but
that framework.
and those that wasn't going to happen if if I'm not able to afford it, I'm not
Right.
able to maintain the. I wanted. I didn't want to have any child go through what I went through. So in order to prepare for those things in the future, I had to do what I had to do to be able to provide the living or the lifestyle that I wanted my kids to have. You said about me being an avid baseball fan. That's why baseball was, later on in life when I did have kids, and two boys, baseball was so important to me because baseball is a game of failure. And I was able to use baseball in coaching my boys. I started travel ball organizations, two teams, and we got to a pretty high level. We were very, for a bunch of local kids, we got to very hard work, and I worked them hard. It was a different organization.
Dad's the coach.
Well, Dad was the coach, but also, we practiced 2-3 times a week, and we played 3 to 5 games on a weekend. You know what I mean? And our practices weren't just routine; they were real practices, and it got to the point where the reputation was that people wanted to play on our team, and I had more than I could. We had to do tryouts and everything else. But what was important for me, for my own boys, was that they learn that a strikeout is not a reason to stand in the corner and cry in the dugout. That they learned that a strikeout was a learning opportunity, something to build off of. What could I have done differently? What did the pitcher do that I should have seen? Was I watching the pitcher batters before to see what kind of arm angle he had or whatever, to pick up any kind of tick I could pick up? And if baseball, if you're successful, 33% of the time you're in the Hall of Fame.
Wow.
And that meant something to me. You know what I mean? And to this day, one of the joys of my life, even now that they're in their 20s, is to sit on my patio and watch a Red Sox game with my boys, because it binds us.
Yeah, absolutely. I imagine. Put all this together. How do you keep up with it all now? I mean, you have the property management company, you have the development company, you have the real estate company with countless agents. You're on Capitol Hill advocating for home ownership. You lead the governor's action, or the governor's, what's it called?
I was on the. I am. Well, I have a couple different roles, but I was on
The government affairs.
Yes,
That's it.
I'm the chair of our
me.
government affairs committee. I was on the board of directors for the Pennsylvania Association of Realtors, Greater Lehigh Valley Realtors. Yeah, I wear a lot of hats. I have a lot of roles. I did learn the hard way again, because I learned most of my lessons the hard way. So I screwed them up the first time or two before I got it right. But it did, when I did get to a point where I was becoming successful, and it did look like things were happening. I was working 80 to 100-hour weeks.
Oh, my.
I was, and I had 2 boys and a wife and a real house this time and all kinds of other things. And I did learn that the lesson of having good people to delegate and work with. That lesson kind of, because coming from where I came from nothing, you kind of get a little bit of the biggest fear you have is it going away. So, and going back to where you were. So when you get to a certain point, you don't want to give up any control, and so I burnt out a couple times, where there was one day for a couple of days, I just couldn't get off the couch, but I was burning myself out because I was afraid to entrust anyone else with any of my responsibilities. Okay.
What did that do, though? What did that do from, being a husband and a father at that time? That's a lot, 100 to 100 hours a week. My goodness.
It was. Yeah, I trained myself to only require 3 hours of sleep a night.
Wow.
That's what I did. I did that for many years. I don't advise that. Because when you're 57, it becomes really difficult to sleep again. But I'm getting there.
Sleep is sacred.
Yeah. No, I would literally get up at 6 in the morning. I always, I'll tell you a really good story. If you want me to throw some Bible in there, I will. When Elias was 2, Yeah, 2. My wife and I would have dinner with my mother-in-law probably 4 or 5 times a week.
Oh, wow.
You know, we would meet at Nick's Family Restaurant in Bethlehem 4 or 5 times a week. And I always took Elias. I always took the baby whenever I could because, I was working and
Right.
I wanted to spend. So anyways, my wife said to me, hey, I'm going to go back to mom's and do this, that, and the other thing. Do you want to take the baby? Elias. And I said, for whatever reason, I just was not feeling well. And I said, no, I don't want to. I said, I can't. And she was actually, really? And I said, no. I said, I just don't feel well. I have a breakfast meeting tomorrow morning. I think I'm just going to go home and go to bed. So I drove home, and I had a Ford Expedition. And I drove home, pulled into the garage. When I pulled into the garage, I realized that my gas tank was on E. And I was like, oh, man, I got to get gas. And I didn't want to do it in the morning.
Right.
So I went in the house, changed out of my suit, threw on just a pair of jeans and a T-shirt and flip-flops, walked out back into the car to go down to the convenience store a mile and a half down the road. When I did that, I was coming around the road, and a young lady in a small car juded out in front of me. And when she did that, I jerked the wheel to miss her. And by jerking it back, I rolled it like it rolled 4 times.
Oh, my gosh.
Over the truck rolled 4 times. And it landed on its side. I climbed out. I remember rolling and saying to myself, I didn't want to go this way, God. I don't want to go this way. And I remember saying that. And you don't have, when you're in that process, it's like slow motion. It's like it's going on forever. It's really only going on for seconds, but it feels like it's going on forever. Anyways, it rolled. I ended up on the side. I climbed out. I stood up top of the vehicle. There's smoke and steam flying everywhere. And I remember a guy saying, don't move. Stay there. I said, I am getting off this vehicle. So I jumped down, rolled over, sat there, and a lady came over to me and she said, I live right over here. I am a nurse. Is everything fine? And I said, yeah. I said, I think I'm okay. I said, I don't feel anything, bro. She goes, can I get anything for you? And I said, yeah. Can you hand me that Bible that's sitting on the yellow lines? Because the only thing, Melody, that came out of that vehicle that was not absolutely broken in half and destroyed was me and that Bible. So you want to talk about a life-changing experience and taking your belief system seriously for the first time, which I hadn't been doing. I learned the value of relationships. I learned the value of trust. You have to trust. Mm-hmm. I learned the value of having a God that loves and cares about you. And from that time on, it just changed my priorities and how I did things.
Wow.
And I started learning to trust by hiring assistants and hiring, other people and expanding things. Mm-hmm. And through that, I am blessed now. I have some of the best employees you could possibly have. I trust them explicitly. They've been with me for a long, long time, and I could not do all the things I do and wear all the hats I do if it wasn't for the people I have backing me up.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Now, so you're, one of the questions I was going to ask was, what role has faith played in your life? You kind of touched on that already, but as far as like this phase of your life, right? So, you're remarried. Mm-hmm. You have 2 grown boys. Mm-hmm. You have a thriving business. Now, do you think you've mellowed? I mean, it was a lot of grit and grind up front. Do you feel like you've mellowed? Now it's time to mentor? Talk to me a little bit about that.
Absolutely. I spent the first half of my careers searching for contentment. Now I look for ways to give back and share. It's not an ego trip. I'd rather, the culture of the day is very, very different than it was when just 25 years ago. You know, the mindset of our youth and those people who are getting into industry, and it's just so different.
Yeah.
I do think that there is a movement happening where we're getting back to our roots, and some, you know, from more of a leadership perspective, a spiritual perspective. I do see things change. And, you know, I like giving back now. I like mentoring, you know. You're only as successful as the person you're mentoring will allow you to be, you know. And, you know, and I am content. You know, I'm not, you know, I don't need to. I enjoyed climbing the mountain. Okay, I enjoyed it. I enjoyed the fight. I loved it. In fact, there were times where I would, you know, in the last couple of years where I missed it. You know, but I've learned contentment. I've learned to give back. I've learned to. I don't have to kill it all the time. You know what I'm saying?
Right.
You know, and I find enjoyment in having time to go to a men's study at my church. You know, having time to go spend time with my wife, you know, and going and traveling and doing those things. And again, I couldn't do it if it wasn't for the quality of the people that I have around me as well.
That's awesome. What's next? And any advice to share with other entrepreneurs and leaders?
What's next for me? I probably will never retire. I'll always do something. You know, and my wife and I talk about this all the time, and she knows. You know what I mean? You know, I don't want to work 80-hour weeks. No,
right.
You know what I mean. There is a wonderful when you learn to say no. It's a life-changing experience because, you know, in the first half I could never say no to an opportunity. You know, now I can pick and choose the people I want to work with. You know what I mean? The things I want to accomplish or see get done. You know, it's a lot easier now in that I don't have to please everyone. Okay. My advice to young entrepreneurs would be never give up, always move forward, get over your past.
Sage advice. Thanks so much, Jack. We appreciate you joining us.
You're welcome. Thank you for the opportunity.